Fine question.
Should be
Okay.
recording now, right? Okay.
Yes.
Good.
I think it's worth repeating what you just said, Felix, because
Yeah.
I think it's
Okay.
extremely important.
I see
Yeah.
I see community moderation as a way for a group of people to create and modify an artifact, which, for example, is a discussion model or a document or anything else, and to decide about proposed changes, if they should be accepted or rejected, and making the whole thing Sybil attack proof, that if like someone creates 1,000 accounts, they cannot take over the system, even if the original members of the team are just size of 10, for example. Yeah. And I have many ideas for algorithms and how to do that. Yeah. Joshua,
I like that.
You're muted.
I like that definition of the problem, because it's much broader than many usual definitions of moderation, but it does subsume them in a very elegant, generic framework. So, full agreement with that.
Sure. So it seems like the other calls, the other CDL calls, there's a wide range of things that we could discuss. So how do we want to spend the rest of the hour? My conversations with Felix and Stephen really came organically over out of the ideas that Gene and I have been chewing on, based on where we think Y-Source, what we think it needs next, and what seems sticky for us. And I'd of course be delighted to just arbitrarily continue those conversations with this larger group and pick them back up about clarification spinning off. However, if we want to, take some sort of other holistic view towards moderation, of course I'm open.
Perhaps an example moderation activity would be a worthwhile endeavor.
Well, I think the whole split up thing where this all started is a really good one, because it touches upon a lot of stuff that some of us that have built systems like this have encountered. It seems to be a common concern: when you split off, how do you split off, who decides to split off, what happens with the old one, what's the process of indicating that you want to split off, what's the language you use to communicate that, etc. The only downside with that specific example is that it touches a lot on the model of like maybe more general and specific claims, but maybe we don't even have to talk about that if we're just interested in the process for now. I don't know.
I thought you were going to say that it touches on a lot, which I think it does. Like, I think the spin-off is one of the more complicated moderation topics. I also agree.
What do you call? Sorry, what do you call spin-off in this context?
Gene, how do you feel about me sharing the Google Doc I've been working on?
Sure.
That seems
I'm
okay,
all for
right?
it. Because one thing is, I said I think Felix's generic does touch your specific, and let's check that.
Sounds good.
So I just pasted a document, which I don't think I've shared with you guys yet. I think it's just been me and Gene internally, which is my thinking about how we should deal with the spinoff situation. So I have to, why don't I?
Unless you want to invite to individuals specifically, then we can just request access.
Only people, anyone with the link. It's fine. Okay, try again.
And nothing too proprietary.
Although it's not a feature I have of all of the argument map feature projects on the internet, I have never come across this feature. An incident that prompted it for me was I was over at Kialo and I saw social media companies should be regulated or should not be regulated by the internet. And this to me seemed like an absurdly vague and broad claim about a topic that's worth discussion. And it's a natural situation where we should have a similar argument that takes a more, a more specific view of how they should be really regulated. And so that was just one real world example that prompted us. And if you guys are in the document, it got me thinking also about the related argument relationship. And why source, we only have one claim can support another, one claim can counter another, but we're starting to talk about how claims could be related. They might be related to each other, even if they don't necessarily support or counter. And as you see, as I started to write about it, I think there's ways we can, I don't feel that we need to build that immediately. I feel that there's ways we can approximate it using tagging. Maybe we need it eventually, but we can algorithmically get a sense of this, at least to start, just because we don't have an enormous budget with a team of hundreds of engineers. It also touches for me on questions of how we're estimating the relative value of arguments, one versus another. There's a question of, if you make a spin-off, is this a replacement? Should a user see the spin-off instead of the original, or should they see both? And so we're overlapping in this question of replacement and value, which I use the word curation when I think about it, because I think about moderation as managing the relationships between community members to solve a problem. But then the question of what should users see is curation, and that's done both by algorithms and by human beings, making editorial decisions. So that's this upper part of the document is kind of trying to do some writing and thinking about those ideas. And then it gets down to the feature section. And the basic smallest thing we could build is just like a way for us to just mark, these are ones that are candidates to be spun off. Like that's the minimum thing that would give us a little bit of progress. And then after we throw a bunch of those flags on content in the site, we can come back and see what they look like and see if they match our expectations. And then it gets into the action, the spin off or related claim, which is the real nuts and bolts of the activity and the tool. So this is a little bit of the state of my thinking about it. And I've also been thinking about what to call it. And I'm kind of liking this spin-off idea. I feel like
yeah, I also got acquainted with spin-off now that I started using it, as you noticed, ever we had that Slack discussion. But before we discuss this in detail, so by dogfooding Socrates, I encountered this. By dogfooding Vice-Source, or even from your actual users, you encountered this. So this is a question to James. When using Concordis, do you know what we're talking about? Have you experienced something similar while using your system?
Yeah, I think so. I think I have not written it yet, but basically my take on it, I think it's similar, is I was calling it forking it. Like you basically fork a project and you can make changes to your local copy, and then you can submit those changes for merging into the original. And everybody can have their own forked version of a document. I don't know how another user would be shown, how you would choose which version to show a user, but you'd probably present it to them somehow.
By document, you mean an entire like argument tree, or?
Yeah.
Okay, we're talking specifically about like one supporting argument for a claim. Like, what if that specific argument is like too broad? The specific example Joshua gave was, what was it again?
Yeah, that's a good point. That would be, you're talking just about the resources required to fork a giant infinite graph, I think. Is that your concern about that?
No, it's more making sure we're talking about the same thing. It's like if somebody adds a supporting argument for a claim,
right?
They're separate needs, right?
You take a claim and you would copy that claim and all of its children to a certain level, and then you could work on that locally and share it around, and
But in that case, are you editing the claim and keeping the children as it were?
I wasn't thinking so. No, I was thinking you would take the claim and have a different take on the claim. The claim would be the same, was my thought. If you wanted to change that, you would take the parent and then change that parent's child, so that there would be a node in common, a root node in common with the canonical, what you might call the canonical version. But anyway, these are just ideas. I mean, I haven't figured it out. I haven't tested it out. So.
The or open question was, did you encounter the problem rather? That you're like, oh, somebody added this claim here now is supporting, like, shit, this is not ideal.
Well,
are we going to replace it? Do we want to replace it? Do we keep it there? Do you recognize the problem?
Can I?
Yeah. I have probably very different needs around authorship than you guys have. People can't edit other people's nodes. That's a thing.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. My control.
Yeah. Oh, that last one is interesting. Yeah, that's a common thing, that each node has an ownership, and it does make the question of how to unify. Like, once they've forked, how do they merge? It makes it more difficult. It's a different way to think about the problem. But what I wanted to say initially is there's really two cases here, and they're not totally distinct, but I think they are. It's one is where you have a very umbrella, broad claim, or and then you get into more specific versions. And it does touch a bit what we discussed about parameterized claims. Or it can be something entirely different. It can be, more specific version of the projects, but they are intended to coexist and to be, you have variants of the claim, or variants of proposed action, or variants of an impact, or variants of whatever, right? And it could take this form or that form or that form, and they can coexist with, here's the umbrella generic version, because it's easier sometimes to speak about the umbrella than to speak about each of the variants individually. So we want to make links to the umbrella, the generic claim, because the specifics don't matter for a specific argument, but for this specific argument here, we want to check the specifics. So that's one case. And the other case is totally different. It's successive improvements to a claim. The claim was formulated in a vague way, and the more precise one is not a variant or more specific, but it's intended to replace the vague, and those are separate.
To which degree does this overlap with the first sentence in the model that Joshua shared? It sounds similar, like more narrowly focused and framed differently, like the more narrowly focused being the formula you said, framed differently being the latter one you said. So if those are the two ones you identified, that would be interesting, because that would seem to overlap with some of those ideas.
I think that's the second one may be framed differently, but the idea is that it may be substantially different, and it may be also framed differently, but it may be intended to replace. And then the moderation question is, does the community agree that this is an improvement to the original or not? And they can have competing improvements. In the choral system, and I was getting there can be, for example, multiple descriptions of a concept, of a claim, that are not necessarily one better than the other, but that speak differently to different people. For example, levels of explanation for levels of expertise, they're all valid, but more pedagogical versus for expert. And they coexist as descriptions. And then they're framed differently, but here they're not intended to replace one another, but they're also not about distinct ideas. It's not the first variant, umbrella and variant case. So that's different. Gene.
Yeah, I was just saying, in the case where it's intended to replace it, we hadn't thought much about having multiple versions representing the same thing. In the case where it's intending to replace it, your second case, like that to me is what we've been calling an edit in our moderation flow. It is a simpler, more straightforward example, and perhaps that would be a good one to tackle first. See if we're all in agreement there, what that looks like.
That is the base case of moderation, yes.
Yeah.
Well, to clarify further though, Gene, I feel like an edit is like, for us, we're editing the text of a claim, whereas a spinoff could involve editing the text as well as choosing a subset of the evidence. Like
agreed.
Yeah.
Which is why it's a simpler version, just to be editing the text to replace it. Yeah.
And then of spinoffs, some of them would be replacements from a curation standpoint, and some of them wouldn't. And that would
Fully
be
agree.
that'd be a thing
Yeah.
to figure out.
Felix?
Yeah, in my opinion, we can have a broader or more generic view on this and say everything of these actions are changes, be it an edit or adding a node, whatever. And I think these changes could be treated very similarly in the sense of that the community has to agree this change should happen or not.
Yeah, but that's a way of talking about it. It doesn't really make it actionable, right? And
I think
disagree.
it does, actually.
by similarly, you mean they all need an agreement of X members in the community, or I mean, to which degree does that abstraction work once you start talking about specifics?
I think it does. Like when we decide how people decide if an edit is accepted for a node, we can use the same mechanism to decide if a node should be.
I think that's premature. I think that's highly premature without knowing the specifics at this point. I mean, it might be that some certain moderation actions you need. Yeah, I don't know. I think
Wikipedia.
Like
Wikipedia does that on a per content basis. Like by default, most pages you can just edit them and someone might edit it back. But if it's like the page for Hillary Clinton, then you're going to need to get, someone's going to need to sign off on the edit, which makes sense to me.
Yeah, and
that's one nice example that the specifics matter. Exactly.
Yeah. And but these kinds of mechanisms, I don't know. I can present some algorithms. I did that in my master's thesis, and I have some more advanced stuff for Sybil attacks. Yeah, and like to have boiled these mechanics down to a simple kind of, I don't know, a system that is independent of the artifact. Like it could be applied to code, it could be applied to a discussion model, and so on.
I'd definitely be curious to see your system. That sounds cool.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I'll look it up and you can continue talking.
Cool. When James used the term forking, that made me realize there's a closely related scenario which I hadn't thought about in a while, which is someone makes a claim and that claim is really making multiple claims, and we want to split it up because we want to argue, like someone puts 2 sentences within a single claim node, and we want to split those up so we can argue them separately. And I hadn't thought about that. We haven't built that yet for YSource. Of course, it's something that any system would need. But just hearing the word fork, that was how I have used the word fork in my mind. And it just made me ask a question, which I haven't answered in my head, is to what degree the reason for forking when a claim is compound and we want it to be distinct is different than the reason to spin off, which is about focus and framing. But I wonder if the tool is actually exactly the same.
Isn't the result the fork? I would say the reason for a spin-off is usually to create more focus, but the result is that you may end up with forks that lead to one or multiple other similar claims, no?
Oh, I want to clarify just quickly. So what I heard you say, Joshua, was a claim can have like reasons or objections, but what I heard you describe is something I've called just parts, which is another kind of child node that doesn't have an opinion about support or opposition, but just splits a compound claim into its constituent parts so each can be assessed independently. That I think is really a nice thing to have for sure, but it's totally different from the concept of forking, which is very similar to what I understand you meaning by spinning something off. So
yeah, that's right. This might just be because of the distinct nature of YSource, but I'm wondering, these are 2 things that are done for totally different reasons, and yet the tool to achieve the ends might actually be a deeply similar tool.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think so.
I think forks are a tool to decide how the change looks like. So you can propose changes via a fork by editing your own fork, or by proposing a change directly. I think that's might be independent of the moderation rules.
I think
might be how the two. Who gets to decide?
Hi. I think they're two different things, right? There's what you're talking about in the case of something that's compound is really splitting. It's not forking. It's breaking a claim into multiple claims. A fork is a copy where you're going to make changes to the copy.
And you intend it to be the same node. It may be, you're modifying it, but you intend it to, it's about the same thing, right? That's the whole point of a fork.
But there's another kind of fork, and this is where, now I'm contradicting myself by giving two uses for the same word as well. But there's a kind of forking that's a copy that you intend to be a different node. And that would be the case of what we're talking about, disambiguation. And now we have two different versions of the same claim, right? They look the same. Now we're going to fork it or make a copy. I mean, you could call it clone instead.
I call those splitting actually, personally, but yes.
Well, see, but yeah, splitting sounds like you're taking one half and leaving it there and the other half and leaving it there. That's why I'm saying when it's a compound, multiple senses, or they're making multiple claims in one thing, you would want to split it. Whereas if I guess it's cloning, you're making a copy and you're going to disambiguate. And I guess we could use fork for one possible process of making changes, which is taking a copy of the whole thing, altering it somewhere, and then trying to merge it back like we do in Git or.
What I hear is
control.
we might need terminology both for the resulting action, regardless of why that action is being done, and separate terminology for the use cases where we actually start. And I think what the intent was of this meeting with like, why are you spinning off, which is also the top of that document. But it seems like it's useful to disambiguate between these two because it makes sense to talk about both. The latter in form of, the actions in the form of modeling efforts, and the why you're doing it in the form of use cases. And I think spin-off is intended to be a use case focus, I think, Joshua, whenever you mentioned it, like when you're spinning off, it's like more from a user perspective. Whether that's a fork or a, whatever you want to call it, or a split, it might both be depending on how you decide to handle the spin-off, if you will.
And depending on the architecture, the split may happen on a fork, right? I don't know if you folks realize that in the hyper-knowledge model, it's been all about this, right? About having everybody work on a fork and then having a voting procedure to decide which of those edits on the fork get applied to the community graph, the community view, the community change stream really, but in the resulting view. So, but there's always been my thought that there could be many merging agreement mechanism, and there Felix has thought about community changing mechanisms much more than I have. And I'm really curious to see his model that way. But the notion that all edits are personal, and that way any edit is a proposed edit on my local fork, as opposed to on the mainstream social system, was key to the hyper-knowledge model of change.
So that was my understanding. But I think what makes me balk at your approach is when you describe it, it's very much analogous to version control, right? To Git or whatever, where, are you talking about making pull requests? Are you talking about long-lived feature branches? Or are you talking about complete forks that people are maintaining on their own and only once in a while merge with each other in a peer-to-peer, as opposed to having a master branch that everyone recognizes as like quote unquote production? And it's when you're into peer-to-peer and each one has their own that I get nervous, and I'm on board with, yeah.
My answer is yes, but I agree with you that they're totally different mechanisms and need a very different handling. When you're peer-to-peer, you need an equivalence table. And basically what you have to do is to be able to have a kind of, okay, here's my local fork of have a feature branch, and then do the mapping between your peer branch and the feature branch of the social, because you cannot do everything through translation and lenses. So it's easier to say, okay, here's the feature branch, and here's how it correlates to my peer, so disjoint peer branch, and have do the social voting more on the peer branch. Sorry, on the local feature branch, because it's easier. And I agree with you. It's the complexity of merging a totally peer branch is high. I want to make that possible, but I do think that the voting will happen probably at the feature branch, because that's so much easier.
Yep. So I agree with all that. I know where Marc-Antoine is coming from. I think that fits my vision. And as Marc-Antoine stated correctly, like I think really about that voting part, like how do we reach consensus? I share again my screen just to show you I think it's now 5 years old, this model. That's the graphic in my master thesis. And it only deals with changes. And that was what we implemented at that time. Like right now, I know in which ways it's broken, but that's one example of these kinds of systems. Like I'll go through it. So the top left, it says like user submits a change request. And earlier it's described that every user has some karma, some reputation points. And if it's above a certain threshold for that post or for whatever, then the post is changed instantly. So if a user has enough permissions, they can just change stuff. But these changes can be reverted retroactively. If someone says, oh, this was a bad change, then it gets reverted. Or validated, and then it's applied permanently. And back there, if the karma is too low, if it's below the threshold, then it's proposed as a change request, like similar to a pull request. And then people can vote if it's approved or rejected. So I'm talking about these kinds of systems and think they can be applied very holistically to different things. Like you can think about, yeah, I'm sorry.
I have a question. So
yes,
in order for a Sybil attack to succeed here, all you need is one person to have high karma. Is that true?
That's true. But a Sybil attack means usually like a win by creating many accounts. So in this case, yes, if someone has the power, then no one is able to take that power away from them. So that's one thing. That's what you say, James, right?
Okay, yeah, that's my curiosity.
The other thing would
I guess the correction there is that wouldn't be a Sybil attack.
Yes, that's what I said.
Yeah.
The Sybil attack happens when people create many accounts to go into these voting points. And
right. So I was just saying the voting can be hacked in that way, but then the gate is actually in the karma threshold for a single user.
Yes, right. So this model has its flaws. I'm just have this as an old example of what I'm talking about. And I have ideas how to solve each of these, I think. But
when votes get reverted, you get negative karma points. Yay.
Yeah. Now I think negative karma points doesn't make sense, for example, because like when you create a new account, you have 0 again. So then you just
then you might go under the threshold, right? So you might be no longer able to do some of these actions that are being reverted.
Can you retroactively disable someone's vote because he lost his karma?
That's also something we can talk about. I'm not sure
I don't know
if it makes sense or not. So to be discussed.
If you allow the masses to destroy other people's karma just through their bad faith voting en masse, then that is kind of a hack of the system.
Exactly.
Because you can destroy people's good karma.
Yeah, and I think the system should be safe against these kinds of attacks.
Precisely, yes.
Feels like we're going down a narrow tail here somewhat, which is not bad necessarily. It just want to point that out.
I
don't think
it's meant as an
narrow.
example.
I'm just super curious to hear what Felix has to say, because this is his master's thesis. So I'm
Fair. Yep.
That was the result of my master thesis. So this simple model I just showed, but I thought a lot about like how can we prevent someone creating the 1,000 accounts and win in voting. And what I came up with so far is have weighted votes depending on your karma.
So like one question is, how important is that part of the equation? Because what I'm hoping for is other methods for user identification that also makes it really difficult to create a lot of Sybil accounts.
That's another angle, yes.
Yeah.
I think these are two different angles. Like that's what I know from your side. You always thought, okay, like if we can give each human one identity and only one, we can limit the accounts per human, then we can basically prevent Sybil attacks. And my angle is we can design the system in a way so we don't need this one account per person thing.
Stack exchange model,
like
right?
people can create as many. Yeah, it's similar to the stack exchange model.
It's very similar. I mean, it's the same. Like not everyone can close questions. You need certain karma, beat reputation to get to be able to close questions, and only then. And there's no real abuse of it because people that have obtained reputation, they have a stake in the system, they like using it, and they're real users. It just
right. But I think
by that. You do get sock puppets, but I mean, sock puppets in a way are allowed even.
That's though I think not applicable to the canonical debate. One of the principles is everybody can participate, and if you specifically, like when I think of that, the minimum level would be, I think, being able to vote your belief and being able to contribute a claim or an argument. I think those are bars that we should allow anyone to immediately without having to build up a reputation. So that's very different from Stack Exchange in that sense. And that's very much an important part of creating trust in the system, because there's lots of ways you can game karma or whatever, and then people just get the opinion that you're creating a platform just for you or something, or for elites or for whoever. But the moment anybody can contribute a claim and you see that claim is represented, it stifles the argument that you're hiding information from people or you're not showing the whole picture. There's the problem of spamming, right? But
yeah, I think it's nice if you require some activity on the platform before allowing people to participate. It's not closing anybody off. Everyone is allowed to participate. It's just they have to know what they're doing first. They have to be familiar with the community and the norms.
Marc-Antoine next, he wanted to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, on the one hand, I'm very close to Tim's argument about the feeling that you can't participate. And I see what you're saying, James, about asking for a modicum of showing your way around. I think there's different kinds of participation, right? And this is where I think the progressive formalization we speak about elsewhere matters. Like proposing content should be very easy. Proposing formal content should be harder because it requires understanding the formalism. And this is where I think that karma showing that you're knowledgeable about interpreting and about identifying logical fallacies and non sequiturs and things like that. I think those I would hide behind a karma barrier as opposed to contributing content, enriching the system. But the other hand is, on the other hand, I'm very divided on this, to be absolutely honest. I believe in allowing people to enter content. On the other hand, I'm aware of disinformation as a weapon, hate speech, and so on. So how do we find a way to probably not take it off, because I think, yes, all opinions need to be represented, but hide some of the emotional charge. And this is a form of moderation, saying, some people are justifying the Holocaust, and couch it in a way that it's not, it's a statement of fact and not appealed to. And this is a reformulation.
I think we can like put hate speech aside in its own little area. Like the way we've thought about it is that we just don't have the resources to moderate hate speech. Like my favorite version of this platform is one where people can post despicable things and then be disproven with evidence. That would be great, but handling that effectively in a public internet requires moderation resources, whether they come from an organization or from volunteers. We don't have those. So we just say for now, this is the definition of hate speech from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that's not allowed until we have more resources. And then we'll deal with it. So I think we can put it in its corner.
But on the other hand, I think one of the points of moderation is, can the community moderate hate speech, right? Can you crowdsource the hate speech moderation process? And I think that's important. Now, there is a moment where somebody has to have legal authority, because the crowdsourced moderation of hate speech can also be abused. And this is where karma plays a role. Like, is somebody actually flagging hate speech or using it as a weapon? And this is where karma plays an enormous role. But just one thing I wanted to say, one other thing before I yield the floor, is one thing that's very important is the distinction between contributing content and maybe editing your own content after you've contributed it because you're improving it, and proposing reformulation to someone else's content. And I saw nothing about ownership in your model, Felix. And I think I don't like strict ownership, because I think things need to be edited by someone else. I could propose and edit to your thing, but that's a very different karma threshold than modifying my own things.
So we basically in that system, and in my master's thesis system, we had like a kind of a continuous ownership.
Yeah, I like that. That's something please do.
That means, like, if you are the creator, then your threshold to edit is lower, but the more views this piece of content gets, the higher the threshold rises until it
stops belonging to you because it's become public property.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah. I like that.
It's very in line with what we were thinking too.
Poetic.
Yeah. I have a question for you, Tim. Sorry, but then you can talk anyways. You said like you want everybody to participate. I'd like to understand, when you is proposing a change that others need to accept, would you say does that fall into your way of saying you're not allowed to participate directly?
I can see, I agree that there are levels of, like there are definitely features I could see gating because you need more experience on the system. The one that everybody should be able to do is contribute a new claim or argument, right? And voting their beliefs.
What does contributing mean to you? Like proposing it or directly adding?
Well, I mean, we haven't gone into the like not somebody else's, something new that you create, right? Being the creator of a claim or an argument, you should be able to do. I think that
everyone without anybody very
well, you know, there's a question there. I think that you could put a gateway in there that says like at least one other person has to approve, or there's lots of different ways that you could have an approval process before it gets through. But at the very least, then the person who created should see that they're being analyzed for approval. The ideal solution, and I don't mean the best solution, I mean in an ideal world, they created, you know, what is the problem with somebody who doesn't understand the system or isn't good at creating new things or just doesn't understand argumentation, creating something? Well, they create junk, right? and the junk piles up in the system. But if it's crowdsourced and there's a good community and that sort of thing, the ideal situation is somebody creates junk, it's accepted, they see how it evolves from step by step as other people take a look at it and massage it into something useful. Or what will happen 9 out of 10 times, they see that somebody flags this as, oh, this is this claim, they just said it a different way. And the person realizes that hopefully their idea has been represented all along. And now they're part of the conversation because they realize their ideas have been included. Right. My one fear is people thinking that there's some sort of elitism going on, or that ideas are not getting into the system through some sort of censorship. Right.
This is really an interesting case, by the way. Somebody proposes something, somebody else says, oh, I think this is the same as that one. And this is where I think a dialogue in the system is saying, oh, yes, I agree, it's that one. Oh, no, I think it's different in that this feature is different between the two versions. This is how my idea is distinct from the previous one. And people saying, no, that's hogwash, it's the same, like especially if the target idea is one that has been heavily downvoted or argued against or attacked on many. Well, my idea is different because, and people will say, no, that's a bullshit distinction. Or saying, yes, this is okay, that's a real distinction, and that means your argument needs to be evaluated on its own merits, distinct from whatever has already been said against that other idea. I mean, this is especially important for trolling, right? The trolls come back with the same argument over and over again and claim it's distinct, and when it isn't. I've observed that a lot. Now, one thing I've thought about, I don't know if it's, is when somebody new comes, maybe we can show the new content to a sample of people before we make it part of the public view, just as a way to not have the public view overwhelmed. Like always have a kind of sampling approval before we make it. What?
A kind of judicial structure.
A kind of,
like
yeah, in the sense that it's random.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. So as to avoid overwhelm with all the new stuff that hasn't been vetted yet, have sample vetting for. I'm not saying it's valid in all cases.
Well, there's one type of validation to get your content added to the website. There's another to have your content on the homepage. For example, anyone can upload a video to Vimeo, and it just has to fit the compression requirements. But if you want your video to be on the homepage of Vimeo, it's going to be one of the best videos of the week.
Right.
So that makes intuitive sense to me, and also adds a little bit of a sort of a safety valve from the perspective of the platform.
But by the way, I speak of this sample voting as a special case because I agree, Tim, that a system where anybody can add something is a necessary system in a federation. We want that to exist. I want that to exist also as a case.
Good.
So perhaps this is a good time to set intent for future meetings here. Where do we want to go with moderation?
Yeah, I think now we know a little bit more of what we're talking about.
Anyway,
like,
okay,
like proposing a way that we can proceed beyond just having a meeting every Wednesday. What we have to discuss are the use cases, the features, right? In the white paper, I more or less tried to lay out different curation actions. A lot of the governance that we're talking about here would come down to curation actions. So it would be a good effort to categorize different curation actions and then maybe talk about what's the burden of responsibility for someone to propose or perform this action. Maybe they fall into different categories. Another angle on that is or maybe it's part of it, because like creating a claim is in this thing, it's a use case. It's a type of curation action where it's adding content. But another part then is, the things around hate speech and spam and how those would also be dealt with. So there are other kind of, maybe the other type of categorization we should do is attack vectors and how to moderate or minimize those, right? So those are two different things we can do either as homework or as a group.
Gene, why don't you jump in?
Didn't unmute. So I guess one point of clarification, are we talking about moderation specifically for CDL, or are we talking about it more broadly? It seems like we were coming in from a broader angle.
Well, that's a third approach, is just talk about different techniques, essentially go over what are the different techniques for moderation and approaches. I think it makes most sense in terms of actually categorizing and trying to come up with solutions if we focus on the canonical debate, because it's the canonical debate lab, but especially as things go on. I mean, solutions are going to have to be very context specific. So if you want, let's talk about the current situation of Ysaurus and what would work best there. That sounds like a good topic for a day, right?
Yeah, I would say it's also very UX specific, and the CDL we're pretty far from the UX, right?
Very good point.
Agree totally that it's UX specific. Like what James was describing as ideas are owned and you can only edit your own, it totally changes how moderation would happen. But I think it's important to, okay, I'm interested in exploring multiple scenarios, right? I'm thinking of, okay, we have communities choosing to, how do communities choose to handle the forks? Are they interested in majority voting? Are they interested in karma? Are they interested in having a kind of compendium of solutions is something and seeing what's the size of the design space around solutions is something I'm very interested in. Voting is classic, karma is classic, liquid democracy is another classic, since we have, I'm talking to actually one of the inventors of the idea of somebody who coined the term of liquid democracy, Bovell. These are all the ways that you can think about. I mean, benevolent dictator is a model. I mean, what are the ways that a community chooses? Like that's how GitHub works, right? We have multiple people who do have or don't have the commit rights, and it's a discrete. You have commit rights. It's a model. It works for them because they're not looking at consensus. They're looking at doing one thing that works. In a consensus model, it's a totally different need, right?
Yeah, and I think the karma approach is far from exhausted. I think there's so many possibilities in there.
And I agree with that.
Yeah. And yeah, I think GitHub is a good way to talk about, because from GitHub we can learn a lot what worked and what didn't. For example, the ownership of a repository and then being inactive like destroys the whole community process, for example.
I'm gonna, on my homework, I'm gonna think about from the Ysaurus perspective, how splitting is different from spinning off, what it shares and what's different. That's just something that I realize I need to look at. I'd be perfectly happy to talk about ownership and permissions in another moderation call. And I'm also of course happy to share what I come up with.
Yeah, so, splitting and spinning up, this is something that is very much at the core of topic mapping. So I would like to go further in that.
Didn't we have a Slack channel for, yeah, CD curation? Here, I see it. Let's revive this one and have all the homework and discussions there. What do you think?
Curation and the curation channel? I think
CD minus curation.
I think I need to join. That's there. I guess I have to join it. Okay.
Yep. And what I'm going to do is like actually write down how I think, like what I have in my head for like how it should look like, the whole voting system with weighted votes and stuff.
Great.
And I'm
awesome.
very interested into attack scenarios.
Great. Yeah. Cool. Yep. All right, everybody.
Cool.
Stay
you.
safe.
Thanks.
See you later.
Thank you. And next call, we organize that in the Hangouts. Bye.
Thanks,
Sure.
Felix.
Bye.